We've already touched on the Sunny 16 rule previously, but I'd like to just use it again just to illustrate how we can use different camera settings, different exposure settings to achieve the same brightness level on the sensor. So the Sunny 16 rule states that using 100 ISO film or sensor sensitivity setting, a shutter speed of 100th of a second, or in our case the closest we can get to with the fixed settings is 125th, and an aperture of f16, which is where the Sunny 16 rule comes from. On a sunny day our image should be correctly exposed, kind of thing. And this is the information we used to get on the boxes of films before exposure meters were commonly available. So if you set your camera to these settings or equivalents that we'll look at, you can be reasonably guaranteed to get a good exposed film and digital sensor in our modern money. So here we have the adjustments that we can use to affect exposure: sensitivity, ISO, shutter speed and aperture. As we go to the left we get less light or less sensitivity, to the right we get more light or more sensitivity. And here we have the ISO settings, so less sensitive, more sensitive. Shutter speeds, less amount of light, 8,000th of a second, all the way up to maybe 30 seconds, loads and loads of light getting onto the sensor. Or more time for the light to get onto the sensor, that is. Lens aperture, and here we have the familiar f-stops. So big F number means less light. Small f number means more light. The aperture is wide open when we get to these numbers here. And we can check the camera's histogram to check that we've got the correct exposure. In this case it probably isn't because it's a big spike on the left. However, let's have a look at the settings that we got here. So remember, in the Sunny 16 rule, 100 ISO, 100th of a second, or in our case 125th closest, f16 would give us a typical sunny day correct exposure. So if we wish to change a setting, one of the shutter speed or the apertures or something like that, but retain the same exposure value on the sensor, then every time we move one control, left or right, by one stop, then we must move one of the other controls by one stop in the opposite direction. Okay, so when I first started out in photography, I used to try and mentally picture how this would actually work. Okay, so say we had the original Sunny 16 settings, and we wish to change the shutter speed to a 30th of a second. So the move from 125th to a 30th of a second means that we're leaving the shutter open for 4 times the amount, which means that we've got 2 stops more light hitting the sensor. The image will now be overexposed. So in order to compensate, using this, if we move one adjustment left or right, we've got to move another adjustment in the opposite direction by the same amount. So in this case we could change the aperture from f16 to f32, assuming that you got that setting on your camera. So we've increased the brightness level on the shutter by 2 stops, which means that we've got to change the brightness level coming through the aperture by 2 stops in the opposite direction, and we will end up with the correctly exposed image. Let's try that again. So we could change one setting by maybe 3 stops and then alter 2 of them to give a total of 3 stops in the opposite direction. So let's have a look at ISO. So the Sunny 16 rule, okay, if you remember, 100 ISO with a 100th of a second or 125th would give us the right exposure with f16. Similarly with 800 ISO at 800th of a second or 1,000th of a second, as near as we can get it, at f16, that will also give us the same exposure. Okay. So let's move the ISO from 800 to 100. So that's 3 stops less sensitivity. So if we were to just take the picture now, it will be 3 stops underexposed. So we need to change these other two, or one of them, by a similar amount. So in this case, we're going to change the shutter speed from 1,000th of a second, very quick, to 250th of a second, which lets in 4 times the amount of light, or 2 stops. Okay. Don't forget that exponential scale, these stops. But it would still be a bit underexposed because we've changed the ISO by 3 stops and the shutter speed by only 2 stops. So we need to change the aperture as well by 1 stop. Okay, so we've now got a total of 2 stops and 1 stop that direction to the left to match the 3 stops of that direction from the ISO. So hopefully you can see that by changing any of these, as long as they all add up to the same, to balance each other out, we can get the same exposure with different values set for shutter speed, lens aperture and ISO.